Welcome to the third lecture this morning, and we looked at pose and proportion in the humanist figures in the West, or ancient Egypt as well. Now I want to go to the Eastern canon of the pose and proportion, more specifically India and Hindu art. And Hindu art has a long, beautiful, complex tradition, not completely free of the West. When Alexander the Great traveled as far as India, he brought with him Greek stylistic and proportion systems, and we can see the influence of Greek art in statues of the Buddha in India during that period. So it's possible that certain traditions from Greece translated into Hindu art and Tibetan Buddhist art as well, since they're very similar, but we don't know for sure. What I can tell you is that the Hindu system of proportion uses something called the tala, and the tala is divided into 12 angulas. Now, the tala basically refers to a face length, but it also, face length being from the hairline to the bottom of the chin, but also if you take your hand and you measure from the thumb to the third finger, the edge of the third finger, you'll find that that measure is basically the same as a face length. So that's why tala means palm, the stretching of the hand from the thumb to the tip of the middle finger. And angula actually refers to the middle section of the middle finger. So it's a finger length. Using the face length, which is to say the tala, most gods, male gods, are 9 face lengths tall, and 9 being nava in Sanskrit. So the navatala measure means the 9 face length measure. Most goddesses are 8 face lengths tall. That's the asta tala measure. But Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma, who are the 3 great gods, the Trimurti, are 10 face lengths tall, typically the dasa tala measure. So you can see that this system of measure goes from the 10 to the 9 to the 8, and as you keep on going down to the Gandharas or Ganesh or other figures, the dwarfs and so on, you can get as low as 3 or even 2 face lengths tall. So let's start with the navatala, the 9 face length measure, and see how many angulas there are and so on. So basically the head, as we've decided, is 1 tala. The torso then is 3. 1, 2, 3. And that brings us to this point that we've seen many times so far. The pubis, and then the lower legs are 2 each, which is to say this part is 1, 2, and this part is 1, 2. So that gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And where is the 9th head then? The 9th head appears at the bottom with the feet, and then again here it can appear with the knees, here with the neck, and either we ignore this portion over here or we add it in. So you add in 3 angulas, here, 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 and here, to give us 12, which is the last face length. So that's the basic. You can see 4 angulas, and 4 angulas. It depends on the system that you're using, right? But it basically adds up to 9 face lengths. If we shift to the another view of the figures, you'll see that basically the pubis is halfway in the figure, right? Here and here, the pubis arrives at the halfway point. And the navel then is 1 tala above the pubis, which is quite a large measure compared to, say, a Western system of proportion. Notice the similarity between that system and the system which we saw with Cennini, where with Cennini we also had the figure being so many, not heads, but face lengths tall, right? And that the same system was pretty much used with 1/3 here, 1/3 there, and 1/3 at the very top. Similar, but not exactly the same. Now, I'm just comparing these two in this slide. And to compare these two, in here, this point is actually a little bit lower. We don't really have the halfway point in Francesco di Giorgio Martini's drawing, but here the half point does roughly correspond to what we call the pubis. And then we would have the space just below the knees being pretty much the same, and the space here at the breast pretty much the same, but there's a lack of consistency when we compare the two in this area over here. Otherwise, they're pretty much identical. Yeah. But you do notice in Hindu sculptures that the hip section over here, even in males, tends to appear fairly feminine, whereas by our standards, you know, whereas the Western view is that the hips are higher up and at least in men, not quite so wide as you find in India. Speaking of lateral measures of the figure, we haven't talked about that so far, but typically all of these measures were drawn onto the stone before the craftsman starts carving, but also they use this system of plumb lines, which is to say a string with a weight on the very end hanging down, and they actually have found these racks with strings hanging down that the sculptor can use to measure out the lateral proportions. And obviously the most important one being the center line, that central vertical. In certain texts it is called the Madhya Sutra, but typically it's called the Brahma Sutra. So the Brahma Sutra is the Hindu name for the plumb line, basically. And it plays the same role as it does in the West, as the line indicating not just the axis of symmetry, but balance, right? That you always have to be acutely aware of gravity in the figure, the line of gravity giving balance. So that's the Brahma Sutra. Then they add other ones on the outside to define the limits of the face, define the limits of the hips, and define the limits of the shoulders. And each of these has a specific name. You know, the Parsava Sutra, the Kaksa Sutra, and the Bahu Sutra. And so they would use these lateral measures to basically define the figure in its lateral sense. So we've seen in the West that the plumb line is traditionally important. In Rubens' Théorie de la figure humaine, for example, he writes about la ligne perpendiculaire, or the perpendicular line that traverses the figure. He says it moves from between the collarbones to the weight-bearing foot, and when a figure moves away from the Brahma Sutra or the plumb line, this principle exists in both East and West. And the question is, what happens when the figure moves away from the plumb line or the sutra? And in Hindu art, you get the bhanga, the pose. And the bhanga is basically a curve, a shift, and they have a way of defining the different shifts that occur away from the sutra. There are different types. There's, starting with the Sambhanga, or also, Sammabhanga, which is also called the Samapada, pada being the feet. And so there's equal distribution of weight on the feet, the soles. So this is your symmetrical figure, basically. No bend whatsoever, the Samabhanga. But when there is a slight shift to one side, you get an abhanga, And the abhanga is now bending almost like a two-part bend, basically, at the hip. It's a slight three-part bend because the head will probably compensate, but often is called the two-part bend. Finally, the tri bhanga clearly says three. Tri is three in Sanskrit, so a strong three-part bend. And there is a fourth one, the ati bhanga, which we'll look at, which is the extreme bend in the human figure. So let's look at them one by one. Here is the samabhanga, or samapada, as it's called, the evenly balanced figure. And this is how we tend to think of hieratic art, from Egypt to Buddhism and to sections of India as well. This perfectly symmetrical deity with its hands raised, perhaps several arms bearing different attributes or mudra gestures to express which god and what powers he or she has. So let's not worry about the actual proportions, but just the pose at this point. What happens when it shifts? Here you can see that the shoulders are still level. Even the hips are fairly level, but there is a bend to one side, so that weight starts to get transferred onto the weight-bearing foot. And as it gets transferred, it comes to the center, and you get this movement. And they're very specific about where the plumb line. In the texts that they have, they speak of the plumb line passing through the navel and through the eye, one of the eyes, not the center of the eyes. And the texts give very precise definitions for how the figure should bend. But you can see this slight three-part bend. I say three-part because it's moving one way, the other way, and then the head straight up. In the tri bhanga now, the strong three-part bend, you can see that the hip has shifted even further outward, so that this arm, which is often called the elephant trunk pose because the arm is extended like an elephant trunk, relaxes against the hip, and you get the strong bend one way, strong bend the other way, the tri bhanga. And this can be pushed even further because these are simply lateral bends at this point. But instead of lateral bends, if you move towards more twists and torsions with dancers and so on, like Shiva Nataraja, Lord of the Dance, then you're in the Atibhanga, the extreme bend of Hindu sculptures. And that's probably the case of a lot of the figures that we see on the facades of temples and so on in India. The dancing figures, apsaras, as they're called, the dancing maidens. So we noticed that in ancient Greece there was this progression from a moderate ponderation to a contrapposto and finally to this figura serpentinata in the Hellenist period. That same progression, if you want, can be compared to what happens in Hindu art. Not that it's an actual historical progression, but that just as we have the moderate ponderation of the Critian boy, so does the abhanga, the slight bend, give you just that slight turn in the hip, but the shoulders otherwise remain lateral. Then you push it a little bit further, and you end up with the contrapposto in the West, such as we saw with the Doriforos, or the tribhanga, the three-part bend, the strong three-part bend in Hindu sculpture. And finally, we can push that even further into something like the figura serpentinata in the West, and that twisting that you get can be compared to an atibhanga pose that you see here in this dancing figure from India. Now, I say dancing figure from India. It's important to remember that a lot of the sculptures that we see on the facades of the temple, this is from Khajuraho in India, and the perhaps most famous because of the erotic sculptures you find on the facade. But those sculptures, a lot of them are depicting dancing figures. And dance in India is a very well-defined iconography of the human body and its ways of expressing itself. Far more precise than anything we have in the West. Typically, historically, in the temple of the goddess, like the Mahadevi temple here, that this is the altar, with the altar is here, the statue is here, with this doorway. This is the main area inside the temple once you pass through the porch. There was also a platform here, and that platform was used for dancers on special occasions, and dancers would dance before the statue of the god or the goddess. Dance was an integral part of what happened in Khajuraho. And so the history of the movement of dance is manifest not just in the traditions of dance that have come through in India, but also in the statues. A woman named Nilofar Haja has written about this in a book called The Celebration of Life, and she writes, even though the Indian dancer can use space more freely than the Indian sculptor, the emphasis is always on the pose, bhanga, which the dancer attains through a series of movements. And neither in these movements nor in the final pose, or karana, does the dancer deviate from the prescribed limitations of the plumb line, sutra, and the relative distance of the different parts of the body in a given bhanga. So what she's saying essentially is that what matters in Hindu dance is not so much the movement, but moving from one pose to another. And that you're constantly moving from one stilled pose to another stilled pose in Indian dance. And that stilled pose must be balanced with aplomb and poise on either side of the sutra, or the plumb line. Sound familiar, right? When we talked about ancient Greek sculpture and J.J. Pollitt, he wrote, a dancer moving in time with music performed specific steps called eremiai, in which the body was held for an instant in characteristic positions. So the same tendency to find pose through movement, but stilled movement, exists both in the East and the West. The dancer that we're seeing in Hindu art, specifically speaking, she's not moving. She's moved into that position, she's holding that position, and she's about to move again. And that movement, that pose, has a specific expression. It has a specific meaning. And the meaning is the passion of the soul, emotion. In the West, the closest we've come to expressing the passions of the soul is this lecture by Charles Lebrun, and it was later published as Expression des passions de l'âme, l'âme being the soul. And as we saw in a previous lecture, he tried to classify emotions into 7 simple emotions and more complex emotions, more than 7. In the Hindu tradition, you get what are called the Nava rasas, Nava being 9. And the different rasas are the different modes or moods of expression. And you can find them in music, you can find them in dance, you can find them in sculpture, and that it's a general thematic, emotional kind of theme or mood in which specific facial expressions and specific hand gestures or mudras will express those. And these are the 9. Basically, I won't go through the Sanskrit terms, but one is love or attractiveness. Another is laughter, mirth or comedy. One is fury. Then there's the compassion or merciful one. Disgust or aversion. A more extreme form, horror or terror. Then finally the heroic mood, wonder and amazement, or peace and tranquility. Those being the 9 basic, and sometimes they say there are only 8. You know, this is not a totally canonical system, but a writer named Bharata came up with this system of 9 basic expressions of feeling in art. So, The Indian dancer, like the Indian sculptor, does not lay much emphasis on the muscles of the human body, but takes the joints and fundamental bone structure as its basics. That might not seem obvious here with this beautifully rounded figure, but the point being that anatomy, in the sense of specific muscles and the divisions of which muscle is tensed and which muscle is relaxed, doesn't matter in Hindu art. As we saw with, say, Michelangelo, it matters a great deal. It matters so much that he had to limit that tendency, and moving from his drawings to his frescoes, he eliminated a lot of the well-defined muscles in order to simplify the expressive line of the figure. I want to finish this lecture then with this image of a dancer, probably from Khajuraho. It's definitely in the Khajuraho style. And you can see now how, even though she's a dynamic, moving figure, she maintains certain, what I call, hieratic qualities. And those hieratic qualities is that you're not concerned with the individual break of the shoulder to the bicep and tricep and so on, the division of the muscles of the arm and shoulder and breast and so on. You cannot see specific bones in the ribs. Even in the face, everything is rounded, everything is stylized. But that roundedness or stylization, which is even emphasized by her jewelry, as if to create this invisible circle or halo, so that all of the features move gracefully in a rounded way to express that style, that beauty, the essence of what is a human face, the essence of what is feminine beauty, and the essence of what is the movement of this female figure, is what makes it into a totally hieratic work of art, so different from the Western conception as come down to us from the Renaissance onward. There's many similarities, as we saw, between the East and the West in terms of their pose and their proportion, and yet stylistically, I think what makes these two traditions different is that the East, such as Hindu art, emphasizes these smooth, curving lines in the face and the figure so as to create these graceful, stylized figures. So that's all I want to say to you today about the pose and the proportion in both East and West. And I hope you found some of those principles enlightening. The point being that these are all sacred codes. Sacred codes are like invisible lines that traverse history. And we don't see the final plumb line. We don't see the final divisions of proportion. All of those lines become invisible by the end. But we need a knowledge of them as artists and to work with them so as to create the movement, create the perfection of the figure in our drawings and in our works of art. And that's what I hope we'll be doing here at the Academy in Vienna over the course of the trimester and over the course of the years. Thank you very much.